Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. You're in for an amazing discussion with two amazingly brilliant women, Anna and Jennifer. And perhaps my only claim to fame for being on this stage is I'm a former school superintendent, large city school superintendent. Otherwise, I'm going to make sure that you get the brilliance from these amazing women. There's a book signing at the end, so I have Anna's book right here. And of course, I have Jennifer's book as well, too. They both signed it for me earlier today. So if you want to go buy the book signing, I think it'd be an amazing thing to actually get to. So I think we're going to have an important conversation, frankly, about what we're seeing right now in the ed sector, especially as we deal with young people who are under a lot of pressure to achieve. I think both of these amazing authors have a lot to add to the conversation. So we'll have a discussion. We'll get practical as well, too, to provide some real world solutions to the work that we need to talk about. And of course, we'll have a time for a Q&A at the end. So again, put your questions, and we'll remind you again in the middle of this conversation to please submit your questions on the app. So why don't we just get started, right? So to the two of you, let's start with a quick overview of the problem. What is at the root cause of this intense pressure many students feel to achieve, and what are the long-term effects? Maybe Anna, you want to start with us?
Sure. So thank you all for being here. I think one of the biggest things that I found in my 25 years of working with students and in schools is that there's this narrow definition of what success looks like, often because we're so focused on what I call this faulty finish line. The major one is around college acceptance, but they start far earlier, right? You're thinking in elementary school, are you in the right math class in middle school? Are you on the varsity team freshman year? There's all these faulty finish lines that lead us to believe that if we don't achieve this any one thing at this any one moment, it'll be too late and we'll have no options. And I think that has really framed the way all kids are really rethinking achievement culture.
Yeah, I second that. I would also offer putting into sort of a wider context where this pressure is coming from. So when you think back, I grew up in the 70s and the early 80s, and back then life was generally more affordable. Housing, healthcare, higher education was more affordable. There was slack in the system. So parents like mine could be relatively assured that even with some setbacks, even with a B- in AP calculus like I got my senior year, that most likely I'd be able to replicate my own childhood as an adult, if not do even better than my own parents did. But modern parents are facing a different economic reality. We are seeing the first generation, the millennials, who on average are not doing as well as their parents. And so the pressure that our kids are feeling, I believe, comes from these macroeconomic forces that parents are contending with today. And so in the words of researchers, parents absorb these pressures, these macroeconomic pressures, the steep divide, the crush of the middle class, globalization, and they become social conduits. They absorb it and they prepare their kids for this unknown future. And so this anxiety and fear that our young people are feeling is really mirroring the unknown future they are going into.
Yeah, I love this push around redefining success or expanding the definition of success, and I'm sure the AI obsession or revolution is only adding to the pressure that we're seeing on a lot of young people. Jenny, if I may call you that, I'm going to go to you. You write about the toxic achievement culture driving intense pressure on students. Can you say a bit about what that means?
Yeah, sure. So in around 2019, two national policy reports came out. One was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The other was the National Academies of Sciences. These are two reports written by the country's leading developmental psychologists, and they were naming who are the kids who are most at risk for negative health outcomes. And they named children living in poverty. They named children with incarcerated parents. They named children of immigrants with few resources, children living in foster care, and then they added a new at-risk group, students attending what the researchers were calling high-achieving schools. Those are public and private schools around the country, generally well-resourced, where the kids go off to competitive four-year colleges. The researchers were finding these kids were now 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorder than the average American teen because of this excessive pressure to achieve. These schools are generally in relatively affluent communities, roughly the top 20 to 25% of household incomes, but it is not the income that is the predictor, is the risk factor. It is instead the ecosystem in the school itself. So kids attending high-achieving charter schools, it's having, the way Anna put it, so many people competing for this narrow definition of success that young people, it becomes this hyper competition, and that is what is leading to the excessive pressure.
Do you think perhaps is our definition of high achieving? As a former superintendent, I always get heartburn when I hear folks about high achieving schools. I always ask, how do you define that? So what do you see in terms of how perhaps as a system would define high achieving schools? Is that part of the challenge that we're seeing as well?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the way the researchers were defining high achieving schools were schools that offer advanced placement classes, schools that have lots of extracurricular offerings, and high standardized test scores, and also a high number of students attending competitive four-year colleges. So that's how they were defining high-achieving schools.
And there's a lot of discussions happening right now around the definition of success, and frankly, even how we look at grades. I know ETS and others on this bandwagon about really redefining what that looks like. Hopefully, we'll get some better answers from the folks who are the psychometricians, et cetera. So Anna, I'm just going to go to you for a couple of minutes here. You've spent over 20 years, 2 decades, working with students and in schools. Mm-hmm. And I've written about erasing the finish line. Mm-hmm. What gets lost in that race, and what should we focus on instead?
Yeah. I think it's really helpful to start with a story to make it, really simple, because I work with kids still today. This week I've been here and I've been on Zoom working with students. A couple of years ago, I had a student whose parents called my office because she was at a highly selective school, college, university, and she was a sophomore and she was on academic probation. And as I started to talk to the parent, I was realizing that this child was really struggling with organizing, planning, prioritizing. They were having a hard time getting to class, making sure they were eating, doing their laundry, just a lot of the life management tasks. And I asked the parent really plainly, when the child was a student in high school, how much of this did you do for them? And they said, I really thought that their job was to go to school and mine was to take care of all the rest. And so what gets lost in this hyper-achievement culture, that the narrow definition of success is your college acceptance, is those fundamental life skills. So my work for the last 25 years is on teaching what we now call executive functioning skills. And executive functioning skills are very simply the skills that you need when you have to focus on something, pay attention, and get things done. And when I think about it initially with students, it's around organizing, planning, prioritizing, starting and completing tasks, and being adaptable when things don't go as planned. And the key thing is, and the thing that I want people to remember, is that we need these skills not just in school, and they're tied not just to academic performance, but also to mental health and well-being. And we know that they're also key for workforce development. In fact, researchers have found that strong executive functioning skills can tie into better life outcomes, a better predictor of life outcomes than IQ scores, test scores, and even socioeconomic status. And yet we're not focusing on these necessarily in teaching these skills in schools. And that's what my focus is, and the work that I do is really focused around.
So I want to dive a bit more into this idea of executive function, right? So we talk a lot about the social, emotional well-being or non-academic skills. I've heard in my work, executive function is actually an academic skill. It's a critical skill required for success. Can you help us unpack that even more as to what that means for our teaching and learning work?
Yeah, I think it's really important to step back and understand that because people often think of executive functions as really academic. And what I also want people to realize is that executive functions, which incorporate the core functions, are around inhibitory control. So can you maintain your sense of composure and your emotional regulation? Can you manage distractions? Can your short-term behaviors mirror what you want to happen for you in the long term, that inhibitory control? You've got working memory. Can you take things that you've learned yesterday or last week and connect them to things that are happening today? So if you learned a math lesson 3 weeks ago, does it relate to what you are learning today, and do you remember that connection? And then the final piece is around cognitive flexibility. How adaptable are you when you learn information? This is really critical for today, right? You've got a lot of uncertainty, you've got a lot of new information coming at you. How do you adapt and change in that moment? Now, what I want people to really realize and understand is executive functions are key, not just to our academic well-being, but also to making and maintaining friendships. Think about it this way. If you really struggle with emotional regulation or inhibitory control, and you have outbursts when something doesn't go as planned, it can be very hard to maintain friendships, especially as you get older. And so much of our conversation around achievement, healthy achievement, and moving away from that is around connection and moving away from a loneliness culture to one where people feel community, collaboration, and connection. But that's not possible without executive functions.
So it really is a complex skill.
Absolutely.
It's required to be taught, frankly, in our schools. So often I hear of a false dichotomy between that kind of work and we got to focus on literacy and math and AP, etc. Help us understand how to debunk this false dichotomy that is either this or focus on or hyper-focus on the AP, whatever, name the class.
Well, here's the thing. So this work is foundational to learning, right? If you think about it this way, if you can't organize, plan, prioritize, get your work done, start and complete tasks, and be adaptable when things don't go as planned, it's going to be very hard for you to feel good about your role in school or your role in the workplace, right? We know that we feel stressed out when we feel like we have too much to do and we don't know where to start. That analysis paralysis that takes over. You know how many people have thought about that shame spiral that happens when you haven't started this very little task that will take 10 minutes, but you put it off for weeks and weeks and weeks. So this idea that it is separate is wrong. And we have to think of it as fundamental, because when we learn and when we help students develop these skills, we find that they're calmer, we find that they feel like they have a sense of control, that they have choices, that they're competent to make good choices, and it ties into their sense of relatedness, which we know all of those pieces, the research shows, is key to intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, I found that early educators and special educators often are the ones who really understand this most.
Totally.
So I'm glad to hear that. And I'm going to stay with you for a little bit longer, and I'll come back to you, to Jenny. So your office is located in the heart of Silicon Valley,
Yep.
right? Yet a lot of your focus is on economic mobility and making sure all students have access to fundamental skills. How did you get there, living and working where you're working right now?
Yeah, great question. So I grew up, my parents immigrated to the U.S. in the 1970s, so that's my story. They came to Bridgeport, Connecticut, which for anyone who's is in Connecticut. And then for the first 12 years of my life, I lived in rural northeastern Connecticut, where they just deliver milk from the farm to your house on Wednesdays. And then I moved to the Silicon Valley when I was 12 years old, to the same town where my office is today. And I often say that was the biggest culture shock, and that, you know, there was such a difference in the educational opportunities for me and even the activities and the level by which activities exist. And in 2017, I was traveling around the country with my third book, Social Media Wellness, and it was all about what happens when we bring technology in schools. And I was having my own sort of existential crisis, like, how did I get here? I'm traveling to 40 cities. I loved it, but I was also like, I was seeing that my students in my office down in the Silicon Valley were having all this success. They were learning executive functioning skills, and it wasn't just academic success. They were becoming engaged in new activities. They were taking healthy risks. And I started to think about, how do we help all students with the skills to get wherever they want to go in order to develop their own blueprint? And that's the concept that I talk about in the book and in my work. How do we help all students get the fundamental skills they need to develop their own blueprint? And so the opportunity arose to do some work in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I did a needs assessment of what are the tools that all students need to succeed. And as a part of that work, I really realized that teaching middle school students in particular, right, around executive functioning skills and teaching teachers around this work can fundamentally change life outcomes. I knew that in my work in Silicon Valley, and then when I was going into socioeconomically diverse middle schools, I was really seeing not just how kids were gaining confidence, but how they were working with each other to build these skills, and it was taking away some of the competition that we feel starts in middle school and high school around academic achievement.
Awesome. Thank you. Jenny, back to you. You write about the importance of mattering, M-A-T-T-E-R-I-N-G. I want to spell that so folks know what I'm talking about. The importance of mattering for student mental health. Can you tell us about mattering and how schools can become countercultural spaces of mattering?
So for my book, Never Enough, I went in search of the kids who were doing well despite the pressure. I call them healthy strivers in the book. I wanted to know what they had in common. What was home life like? What did their parents focus on? What was school like? What were their relationships like with their peers? How did they see their sort of lives in the larger community? And I found about a dozen or so common threads that these healthy achievers had in common, but it boiled down to this. The kids who were doing well despite the pressure felt like they mattered for who they were deep at their core, away from their achievements and successes. And importantly, they were also relied on, depended on, to add value back at home, at school, and in the wider community. So mattering acted like this kind of protective shield. It didn't mean that these students didn't have setbacks. They bombed tests, they got cut from teams, they got rejected by friends, but mattering acted like a kind of buoy that would lift them up. The kids that I met who really seemed to be struggling the most were kids who generally fell into two camps. They were kids who felt like their value, their mattering, was contingent on how they performed, as if they only mattered when they did well. And then the other group of kids, and this surprised me, but it makes sense, were kids who felt like they mattered. Their parents loved them unconditionally, they felt that, but they were never given an opportunity to add value back to anyone other than themselves and their own resume. And so they lacked what I call in the book social proof, that they mattered. Mattering is really, if I could just dork out for another minute on mattering. So mattering is not my idea. It's been around since the 1980s. It was originally conceptualized by Morris Rosenberg, who brought us the self-esteem scale that is still used today. And what he found back in the 80s were that young people who felt like they mattered had a high, healthy, not just high, a healthy level of self-esteem. So they weren't narcissistic, but they had a healthy level of self-esteem. And it's been studied now all over the world, among all ages. Mattering, the researchers who study it say that after the human drive for seeking food and shelter, it is the instinct to matter that drives human behavior for better or for worse. And so when we feel like we matter, we show up to the world in positive ways. We want to be a good student. We want to be good to our friends. We want to be pro-social, good to the environment. But when we are chronically made to feel like we don't matter, or when our mattering feels contingent on what we do, what we look like, we could turn against ourselves. We can become anxious and depressed, perhaps turn to substances to alleviate the pain, or we can act out in anger. School shooters among the most tragic examples. Oh, I don't matter, I'll show you I matter. So mattering is a profoundly deep but simple and intuitive and practical tool that I have found schools can use to buffer, not only buffer against the pressure, but to set kids up on a healthy path to achievement. Just one more point I want to make. Mattering and achievement are not mutually exclusive. It is through mattering that we have the confidence to reach for high goals. So the healthy strivers that I met, they weren't afraid to reach for big goals because setbacks and failures were not an indictment of their worth. They knew they mattered no matter what. So mattering as the pathway to healthy achievement is what I found.
I really like that. I mean, I wish I knew more about that when I was a teacher and I was a school principal. Is that like belonging? Is that the same thing? Or is
So that's a good question. So mattering is a meta need or an umbrella term. So underneath it is connection, belonging, self-determination, mastery. And here's where mattering goes even deeper than belonging. You can belong to Classroom 301 and not feel like you really matter to that class. You can belong to the football team and not really feel like you matter to that team. So mattering goes deeper than belonging.
So we're going to get a bit practical before I ask you the next question. Just remember, if you have questions, please submit your questions on the app, the South by Southwest Go app. So I want to come back to getting really, really practical here. You talk about doing this in schools. Can you say a bit more about what would this look like in practice in a school, in teaching young people how to matter or that they matter?
Yes. So I co-founded, this was a question after my book, Never Enough, was published. Schools were coming to me and saying, I need more. I want to implement this. So with a colleague, I co-founded something called the Mattering Movement. And there's a website, free tools are available for educators there. We created a curriculum that's being used in schools around the country, in advisory. So how do we make kids feel like they matter? First, it is creating this sense of unconditional worth, which is really hard, right? In a system that ranks kids, that grades and judges kids. And so some of the schools that have done a great job of this have helped our students turn their self-focused lens outward and show them where their talents, where their strengths could match a genuine need in the world. So one of the fastest, quickest ways for us to feel like we matter is to unlock it in someone else. And the one way to unlock it is to fill a genuine need. What are the needs of this school community? What are the needs of our neighborhood or our wider community? And what do we have to fill those needs? My co-founder worked at the Trinity School in New York City, an independent school. And what she did, she started the Office of Public Service there. And what she would do is she would say to the kids, it's in the center of the Upper West Side in New York City, she would say, what are the needs in our community? There was actually, if I could tell a quick story, there was a public school across the street. And Trinity, the school that my friend was working at, is a very high-achieving school, one of the best in the country, actually. And she said to the kids, what do you think is needed by this school across the street, which was an under-resourced public school? And they said, oh, tutoring. And she said, what makes you think they need you to tutor them? And they were like, oh, I don't know, we're good students, we'll tutor them. She said, you know what, let's go over to that school and let's actually find out what is the need here. And so they did. They went and they met with the head of the school, and the head of the school said, actually, we don't need tutoring. What we need is help at the lunch hour. What would be great is if your students could each sit at one of the tables and just monitor them, because we only have one lunch person. It was the only time the educators had off for lunch, all at the same time. And so these students went, and at first they were like, this is not using my skill. I'm a smart student. But what they learned in that moment was actually they were filling that need. The younger students that they were helping and mentoring, you know, they refereed conversations. They taught them about healthy meals. They taught them how to recycle. And they saw what was a chaotic cafeteria experience turn into a calmer experience. And it was because of them and because they mattered.
That's awesome. Thank you. Again, I wish I knew so much more of this when I was a teacher. You know, as a parent, I mean, I have 4 children. 3 are still in high school, in elementary and middle school. You know, I worry a lot about overwhelming them, right? And I worry a lot about the partnership I have to have with my teachers and with their teachers to put in the work. So how can teachers partner with parents to encourage achievement without overwhelming young people?
Yeah, I think as educators, one of the best things you can do, I'm the daughter of an educator of 30 years. My mother taught high school English. I will say it has never been a harder time to be an educator. I will also say it's never been a harder time to be a parent. And so meeting each other with empathy and compassion is the start of building that relationship. I also think educators do a great job because they understand kids' unique strengths. When I go back and I think about what teachers have said about my children over the years, boy, teachers saw it before I did. It was amazing. So you guys are really like trained and zooming in on the strengths. So when a child isn't succeeding, partnering with parents and assuring them that all children want to do well, right? All humans want to do well. So if a child isn't performing, to encourage the parent to get curious, not furious. Try to get below the surface. What is going on here? Maybe there's an undiagnosed learning difference. Maybe there's a social situation in the classroom that's hijacking important cognitive resources that should be spent on learning. And so helping parents really get curious about why their student isn't performing. Let's pretend that they got curious, not furious. Then maybe explaining to the parents that some students need more scaffolding. And so teaching kids how work gets done instead of focusing on shiny outcomes. Because I think as parents, we often just kind of lean in on the shiny outcomes. I just want to see A's. Why aren't you doing better in this quiz? Instead of looking back and seeing about how the work is getting done. Because if we focus on that, how the work gets done, the good grades will come. So helping parents get curious, not furious.
I really like that. I just wrote that down, curious, not furious. I had an argument with a reporter in one of the cities I worked in a few years ago who asked me, what do you do with the kids who don't want to learn? I said, I've never met a learner or students that don't want to learn. Anna, do you want to jump onto that one?
Yeah, no, I think one of the biggest things is figuring out what makes each child motivated. And so one of the examples that I'll give, I talk to students all the time, all over the country, around executive functioning skills. And the way that I talk about it is I make it all about them. And in my office, you know, parents often ask me, how do you get kids excited about being organized and managing their time? And because it's all about making it all about them. And what I mean by that is when kids understand that their daily habits and weekly routines tie into their overall well-being and their own personal and academic goals that aren't grade or test score focused, but really focusing on what's important to them, there is a motivation that ends up happening. So a quick story that I often give is, a lot of times when kids will come out of the presentations and teachers will ask them, what did you learn or what did you think? Oh gosh, I need to get more sleep. And so we know that sleep is this major factor. We know kids are not getting enough sleep typically by high school. They need about 8 to 10 hours of sleep. And when I work with students, and we know also, by the way, that sleep and stress really impact our executive functions. So if you're undergoing incredible stress or trauma, or you're a child who's had a lot of household dysfunction, your executive functions could be 2 to 3 years behind in terms of development. And I see that all the time. I've had a student who was, you know, their parents were undergoing a very significant divorce, very difficult divorce, and the child's basic executive function processing speed was fully impacted. But back to this example of sleep, the way that I look at it with students is, what's important to you? So your academics and your learning. Well, research shows that the sleep you get after you learn new information is key to comprehension. And if you want to do well on a test, getting to sleep early really helps with your focus and concentration. For students that are really focused on athletics, I talk to them about how sleep is key for injury prevention and muscle recovery. And then most students will say the social piece of school is what they remember most and what's most important, because we know the social affects the academic. And we know that sleep impacts our ability to emotionally regulate, to be adaptable. When something doesn't go as planned, how do we react? How do we recover? You know, a lot of times people use the term resilience and grit, and what I like to use is this idea of buoyancy. How much time and energy does it take you to bounce back when there's a disappointment or something doesn't go as planned? And then tying that again back to sleep. Because the whole reason that this works is that when you get students to see the impact in their lives and the lives of those around them, they sort of start to perk up. And one of the things I see in my weekly meetings with students is still this, where I'll ask them, you know, what are 3 things you want to work on? And we're talking about habits, right? So just on Monday, I was talking to a student, a high school freshman. She has struggled with anxiety for a long time, and one of the things we came up with together was around reading. She decided she wanted to read, and she comes to the session and she goes, I'm reading before bed, and it's amazing. I'm getting to sleep faster, and it's better, right? And so tying all of these habits into their behaviors also ties into this idea of every kid has something that's important to them. And our job as trusted adults is to figure out what that is.
And tying sleep deprivation or sleep to working memory is also another piece. So getting practical, you started in that direction, we'll continue.
Yeah.
What have you seen work really well in schools, and what have been the challenges around this kind of work?
I think it's really important to back up and echo what Jenny had to say, that educators have so much that they are navigating today that sometimes just getting through the day is the biggest accomplishment of all. And so 6 years ago, I started this nonprofit initiative, Luminaria Learning, and my goal was to help students learn executive functioning and skills in schools. We started with middle school, and now we have a high school curriculum as well. And what I found was this: one, that so much of the work benefits teachers, not just around adults themselves. We were never taught these skills, right? Around organizing, planning, prioritizing, developing a system that works for you. And also it reduces teacher feelings of burnout and improves teacher retention. And so thinking about when we work in schools, what works well is creating the time, structure, and support. It takes less time than you think that students can do what I call regrouping. So when we first were piloting this with a bunch of 6th graders, we were really, building the plane as we were flying it, and I would have these weekly focus groups with 6th graders. And it actually kept me going because it was very hard to develop this curriculum and do all the things. And these 6th graders, Tuesday would be the day that they would do this 25-minute activity, and this idea of regrouping is sort of getting yourself back on track, right? Setting up a time every week. And one of the students said to me, Tuesdays was the day, and they were like, we want more Tuesdays. That's the day I feel the least stressed and the most in control. And so this idea of creating time, structure, and support within the school community, and then also supporting parents in doing this at home and caregivers, of finding that time so that you can say, you know what, you might have started the week with the best of intentions. How many of us have done that? And then by Wednesday, you're kind of like crawling, and then Friday, you're like, gosh, where is the finish line, right? And so thinking about what are the things we can put in place, whether that is a block of time without distractions. When I visit elementary schools or K-8 schools, I talk about what are the spaces of silence for each student throughout the day so that they can regroup and emotionally re-regulate. Because if you're in a really crowded lunch period and then you're going to school in the afternoon, for some kids, that's just sensory overload. So what are the things that we can do throughout the day that support students, and then what are the things we can do at home that build in those spaces?
I did a keynote a few weeks ago in Houston with a group called Ed Spaces.
Yeah.
These are school designers, these are architects, etc. And we saw connections between what you just described and how we design classrooms in schools to really support the holistic approach to education. Having spaces for kids to decompress, to go off. Really amazing work being done by, again, these new types of facilities people. We're not building boxes anymore, hopefully, but instead building spaces for young people. Jenny, turning to you for a second. You tell a story about work you saw seen in Cleveland, Ohio, around this idea of helping kids turn their self-focused lens outward, both as a way to protect their mental health, to encourage healthy achievement. Tell us a bit about that story.
So I've traveled the country, both reporting the book and now speaking at schools around the country. And I often speak with middle school students and high school students, and I ask them this question: why do we learn? Why do we have to learn how to be good writers? Why do you have to learn how to memorize a poem and stand in front of the class to give it? And they don't know. They don't know why they're learning. Some of them will say college at the high school level. We want to get into college. We want to do well so we can get into college. And I visited a school in Cleveland, Ohio, that did something that I thought was pretty extraordinary and pretty simple that every classroom could do. So let me just zoom out for a minute and tell you their school motto is the Jesuit motto. It was a Jesuit school: not better than others, but better for others. It was a very high-achieving school. Their athletes won national championships, but it was not just about them. That was a school that helped them balance their individual needs with the needs of their peers and the wider community. So here are a few ways they did it. At 2 o'clock every day, the lights would go out, and these are big, this is big high school kids. The lights would go out, and over the loudspeaker for 2 minutes, either a student or a faculty member or a member of the staff would talk about a need in the world, a genuine need in the world. One of the days I was there, they talked about how families living in poverty were disproportionately impacted by climate change. It was not a lecture. It was not, okay, now, today, right now, you have to go fix this, let's solve it. It was simply raising an awareness that there are people out there who are going to need their help one day. I'll tell you a quick little story for any coaches out here. The soccer team at St. Ignatius is #1 in the country. And I asked the coach why he thought that was. And he credits it with an idea that he got from a team in South America, where at the beginning of every season, his soccer players are given a yellow tennis ball, and a felt pen. And he said, write here who you are playing for this season. Your grandmother, your mother, God, but you're playing for somebody more than yourself. They have to bring that tennis ball every day to practice and to every game. And if they do not bring it, they do not play. And they are the #1 champs in the country. Coach Mike, who is the soccer coach, also teaches a community service class. And he starts each semester, he starts the class with a simple exercise that I thought was an interesting way of, well, let me tell you what the exercise is, and you tell me if you think it's interesting. So he asks the kids to write down 2 columns. The first column is all the things that they've done in the last 2 weeks that have contributed to their success. Then in the other column, he asks them to write down everything others have done to contribute to their success. And then he asks them to put a percentage on the 2. And he said usually it's around 95% of their efforts versus 5 to 10% of others. But then he presses them to think more deeply. He says, who drives you to practice? Who stayed after school or came in early to tutor you so that you could do well on that math test? And what these kids start to understand is that they are dependent on other people to make them a success, and that there are people in this world that are going to need them too. So what they have done in this school is they have built a for other mindset, is the way I speak about it in the book. They have taught kids that they are being successful, yes, for themselves, but also for something bigger than themselves. And we seem to have lost that in our hyper-individualistic culture. I mean, I think that it used to be part of a belief system in our culture, the for better, for others, for the common good. We don't hear that as much anymore. And so what this school was doing, and what any school in any classroom could do, really is to become a haven from those sort of toxic messages and the false belief that we succeed alone. So it's when I think about what schools can do to foster success and thriving, I think about teaching our kids the skills of interdependence, how to rely on others and how to have others rely on them in healthy ways. Not only does it make them better students, it also makes them better citizens of the world.
What I love about the way you guys talk about this is these are malleable skills that can be integrated into the fabric of a school, into curriculum, into pedagogy, and includes the parent, frankly, in that discussion as well, which I really love about that. I love this idea of better than others, but better for others, which I really love. Anna, you talk about economic mobility. How does this apply to workforce? Do you see a connection at all? No?
Yeah, I think that I want to step back and also say how Erasing the Finish Line, my latest book, came to be. So I've written 4 books. This is my 4th. And one of the young men who was in my first book, which was called That Crumpled Paper Was Due Last Week, it's all about helping disorganized and distracted boys. And the book came about because a college student affairs officer in 2005 said, we have a real crisis in boys' education. They're not going to college at the same rates. They're not graduating. And I looked at him and I said, have you looked at their backpacks in middle school? I can tell you a lot. But one of the boys in that book, Henry, who is named Henry in the book, and Henry was, diagnosed with ADHD. He had a 2.8 GPA, and by the end of his senior year, he had a 3.8 GPA, and it wasn't about the grades. Henry had become a leader, so much so that his principal said, oh my gosh, I had no idea you were working with him. He has become such an evolved leader within the community. It was all about how he engaged within his community. And that was what teaching these executive functioning skills did. It wasn't about the grades or the test scores. It was how people were able to connect with others across differences, how they were able to see possibilities that they wouldn't have thought before, how they were able to find mentors and sponsors, some of the work that I talk about in the book. So anyways, go fast forward a number of years, and Henry's mom contacts me, and she says, Henry's thriving in the workforce, and he says all of the things he does every day in his job are based on things he learned in your office. And so Erasing the Finish Line is not just about the fact that we should stop looking at college acceptance as this faulty finish line, but also about what are the fundamental skills. There's 4 pillars in the book, systems, connection, perspective, and acceptance that all kids need to thrive. So when you think about that, I went back and I interviewed my students from 10 to 15 years ago. They're now in their early 30s. I heard their stories about what happened beyond. What were the things that have helped them? And so when you think about economic mobility, it's really important to back up and say, we can get you mentors, we can get you sponsors, but if you don't have these underlying skills around organizing, planning, prioritizing, around connecting across differences, around expanding your perspective through exposure and shared experience, and having a sense of acceptance for yourself and for others. It's going to be very hard when you're put on stage. So this idea of sponsorship, as you know, we've talked about this before. We have a lot of mentors in this world that are wonderful. And so I think about mentorship as this idea of making sure that you're prepared when you get on stage. And I think about sponsorship as making sure that person gets on stage. And so when we think about all of the skills every student needs to be economically mobile, to have mental well-being, to be academically successful, it's really about supporting how do they build these skills fundamentally at the core when they're in elementary school, middle school, high school, and beyond.
Thank you. I did an experiment. I joined my organization about 4 years ago, actually almost exactly 4 years ago. And I sat with the leadership team and put a Google sheet, a doc on the screen, and I said, I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes. Listed 3 things that were instrumental to your success. Mm-hmm. I have an LT, a leadership team, highly credentialed folks, PhDs from MIT, et cetera. After 15 minutes, a single person listed their academic credential. Mm-hmm. It was everything else. That was what made them successful. And the question I asked him was, what are we then teaching in school? That pushed that conversation. I'll add one more thing, really gratifying to see what is happening across the country around the portrait of a graduate. States are having it, districts are having it. It really brings together the academic and perhaps the non-academic development, which we know are critical for young people's success. So before we move to questions, one last thing from the two of you. Perhaps one actionable takeaway from about what parents or educators can do.
Yeah. So one thing parents can do, I think, is just audit. Where are your children in terms of the skills that they're going to need if they leave home? What are the things that you're doing for them that they may need to do themselves? So back to that original story of that student that was on academic probation. Within 6 months of really developing these skills, it was a complete turnaround, but not only in her academic, outcomes, but also in her personal self-confidence. So thinking about doing this audit of, and sometimes we do this with kids, so we have kids list all the things they think their parents are doing for them, and the parent and caregiver do the same thing and then compare lists. And then have the child decide what are 1 or 2 or 3 things that that they want to take over, or start taking over as they move towards interdependence, as we talk about. And then for educators, it's really doing an audit. A lot of my work around executive functioning and bringing technology into schools is thinking, okay, so now that we have all these learning management systems, how are kids, finding out what the homework is, submitting the homework? How is that different across classes? What are the spaces of silence for every child throughout their day so that they can regroup without needing a meltdown or a timeout? And this is true for every age group. And so thinking about what is that student experience and how has that changed, right, in terms of distractions, and what are the things that we can do to provide time structure and support?
I would say the number one piece of advice is actually the number one intervention for any child in distress. And this is according to decades worth of resilience research. It is to make sure the caregivers in that child's life, the parents, the primary caregivers, including the educators who are with them all day, that their support system, their mental health, their well-being is intact, because our children's resilience rests on the resilience of the adults in their lives. And adult resilience rests on the depth and support of our relationships. So if there's nothing that you take out of this today, I hope it is this, that for the betterment of your students, we need to go upstream and take care of the adults in their lives. Educators, their well-being, their support system has to come first. A famous educator once said, teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions. So, we are often told as caregivers, as you are, as educators, to put on our oxygen masks on first. But what the resilience research says is it goes deeper. And what it says is your friends, your relationships are your oxygen. So invest in 1 or 2, 3 friends who can see when you are struggling, who are close enough to you, who will put the oxygen mask on for you, so that you, in the words of Sunya Luthar, who was one of the world's leading researchers who passed away recently, that the adults in children's lives are their first responders. You are the first responder in the classroom. Parents are the first responders at home. Take care of yourself as a first responder. And I know that's hard, and I know it feels like another to-do, but there's nothing more important that you can do for your students than to take care of your own well-being and support.
Thank you. I'm looking at the questions that we're getting coming through the app. I'm going to try to combine a few of them. I've seen this personally, the ideas of perhaps situations where parents are putting a lot of pressure on their children in the school, etc. And this idea of it's a high achievement. And how do you help teachers navigate that when the parent is the one pushing? Perhaps you can even see the pressure on the child, him or herself. Any advice for these educators?
I want to give a macro advice. A macro advice is if you have a school where, there is an excessive pressure to achieve, one pathway into talking about parents is to get a survey of the climate of your school. There are wonderful surveys. Authentic Connections is one where schools go in and they take the temperature of the students and the educators and use that as a pathway to talking about parents so that it doesn't feel so personal. Here's what we have found out about our school. Here's what we know about your specific child's grade. Here is what they are feeling. So making it less personal and giving parents the context of what's going on in the grade.
I also think it's helpful, just as a micro level, when I talk to parents, because I work with parents, and I have for over 2 decades now, is that I always come from a place of compassion and empathy, especially as I think about my own parents who are immigrants, who are just trying to figure out this invisible handbook. There's so much information that they didn't know, and some people could think, right, that some of this feelings of intense pressure or these questions that parents have are coming from a place of, anger and frustration, but really some of it's just worriment and fear. So I always say, have this opportunity to ask open-ended questions without judgment, and take the moment to see, what is the reason? What is the root cause? What is the goal? Because a lot of times when I ask that question, sometimes I'll get these emails. I don't know, educators in the room, you'll get these emails. They're single-spaced, 2 pages long. And you're like, oh my gosh, I can't answer this email, but I'm going to call sometimes or whatever. Or you'll have a conference as a result of it. And think about, what is the root cause? Is it a fear? What is the hope as well? And so how can you help the parent navigate what their own fears are and their own stuff? So similar to what Jenny said around putting on that oxygen mask and adults in the room, I realize that a lot of adults have not developed some of these skills themselves. They've never been taught it, right? So skills around resilience, and my term buoyancy, how much time and energy does it take you to bounce back? So a lot of times it's not the challenge with the students, it's more with the parents. And so taking that approach of asking open-ended questions without judgment has really been a great starting point in my work with parents.
I saw a question here around growth mindset. So how does that, everything we're talking about, align with this idea of growth mindset?
Well, I'd love to say something that I found in the research on growth mindset and grit, and that while, of course, it's helpful, it's not necessarily helpful for every student. If you have a student who is experiencing excessive pressure, if they are exhibiting perfectionistic tendencies, the research finds it's not that these kids need to believe in growth mindset, it's that they don't have the self-regulatory skills to know when to stop. And so but several parents that I spoke with talked about how growth mindset actually fed the anxiety and the perfectionism of their young child. And so what I would say is, just as educators, to be mindful about using it as sort of a blanketed intervention with students, and instead notice the students who maybe need to be encouraged to pull back a little bit.
So there's a question here about looking at what you're talking about against the system. We know in some cases, you look at accountability, this is how we measure, again, the high-achieving schools, for example. In others, we look at the number of AP classes kids are taking and what kind of colleges they're getting into. How do you balance this push by the system to define high-achieving to what we know needs to happen for our learners?
I think it's starting by educating parents early in kindergarten, in first grade, letting them know about the pressures that are on these kids. Here's something that I didn't quite realize before I was researching this book. Achievement mattered when I was growing up, but it didn't define my childhood the way it does so many young people. So what I like to say to parents is, your kids are getting signals about achievement everywhere. They're getting it in the wider culture. They're getting it on social media, with their peers' parents. They don't need to hear it also from you. Trust us, your kids want to be a success. Let's focus on how we can scaffold them so they can do it in healthy ways.
I think that one of the things that's important to step back for every kid and figure out, how can they create their own blueprint? And how can that counteract the conversation around how many APs? Like one of the public schools near my house, they have open enrollment for AP classes. So students are constantly like, by sophomore year, can I take 5 AP classes? Can I take 6? And what we're really focused on is, again, looking back at those daily routines and habits and helping students become what I call savvy consumers. So instead of saying, you know, what college will take me as an example of savvy consumerism, it's where are the many places that I can thrive? What's the schedule that's going to work for me, regardless of what other people are doing? And what are my values and how is that reflected in my choices? And so helping students back up and think about those bigger picture questions also allows them to, even within a school where people are talking about achievement in that way, to reframe things for themselves and step out almost of the conversation. I've seen it work.
I'd love to jump in on what you were saying. What I heard over and over again from the young people who were taking all the APs, who were slamming themselves with extracurricular activities, sacrificing their sleep, sacrificing downtime, time with friends, is that they were the kids on the weekends who were drinking to blackout. They did not know how to regulate themselves. They didn't know how to stop. They were in this sort of cycle of never ending. And so what I often say to parents is our job is to be their prefrontal cortex. Our job is to be the balance keeper of their lives, to look at their calendars, to sit them down and say, here are the things in our family that we need. 8 to 10 hours of sleep, that's a non-negotiable. Downtime, X number of minutes a day, non-negotiable. Time socializing, non-negotiable. And now let's look at the AP classes. Now let's look at your sports schedule. And let's do the math. How much time do you actually have? And here's what, I think kids don't understand that AP classes are supposed to be college level classes. They don't get it. They don't understand before they take it all on. And then they find themselves in the middle of the semester, I'm sure you see this, drowning. And then sometimes using unhealthy coping skills to cope with that. So what I say to parents is our job as parents is not to push them, not even to push them, but to encourage everything that they want, to support everything they want. We have perspective, we have wisdom. Our job as parents is to teach them how to build a life that they will not one day need drugs and alcohol to escape from.
So I feel like I have to come to the defense of AP for a second. I worked for the College Board as an advisor a number of years ago. The AP capstone course, the IB work, we know is trying to get us in that direction on the experience versus collecting 15 AP courses before you finish high school. I want to get to a serious push here question around academic pressure and how do you recognize that? Because we've seen even suicides happen in high schools, for example, with young people. What are the warning signs of a child being pressured and what can teachers do to intervene?
So I would say some of the warning signs that the research points to are excessive comparison and envy, which starts to crop up in 7th grade. Another one, obviously, and I think this is obvious, cheating. Cheating is another sign. Immoral behavior is another sign.
I mean, one of the things that I think for educators is helpful is what are the structures that they can put in place to support back to this idea of developing executive functioning skills and putting in the time structure and support. And why I say that is that there can be systems in place that where you see a kid getting overwhelmed and you can take them aside and say, where are you in terms of evaluating different elements of well-being in your life, right? So whether that's around sleep, whether that's around how much time are you just being able to do things that bring you joy? And when they can't answer those questions or it becomes very difficult, like what do you like to do for fun? So my book, when I talked about the myth of the perfect girl and the culture of perfectionism in girls, I opened the book with a story that seems relevant now more than ever. I would ask girls, what do you like to do for fun? And they would look at me like I was strange. And I gave them the summer activity to find out, what do you like to do for fun? And so it ties back into this idea of what do we do when students are struggling under the weight of academic pressure? They don't know what they like to do for fun. How can educators intervene? They can really start to ask those open-ended questions without judgment.
So I'll end perhaps by we didn't talk about AI at all in this conversation.
I know.
But it's an opportunity to really lean on the joy of learning, to provide space for us, frankly, to engage perhaps in the kind of learning we want our kids to actually engage in. So please join me in thanking these two amazing
Thank
ladies.
you.
Thank you for
so
doing
much.
an amazing job. Thank you.